And we are live. I hope everyone out there can hear us. I'm just waiting for the stream on my end to catch up. How you doing, sir?
I am doing great. How are you, Script? It's a good day to read a nice script and talk about it.
It definitely is, and it's nice to have you back. I mean, you've got a very popular second thoughts there with the Madden script
Oh,
that we covered at the start of the year, and yeah, now we got you on for the full show.
yeah. I just in all the other scripts we've been covering, I just didn't have I mean, compared to Madden, which really just got me going. There was like I don't really feel like compared to what you guys already talked about, I had a lot to offer the conversation, so I just didn't get in there. But so I'm glad to be back here, talking about the one we're going to talk about today, and it's going to be a good time.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, that's why I have the second thought thing. Is it's not mandatory part with any of the crew back here. It's just really like, hey, sometimes someone might have another opinion. They're not on the Saturday show. Keep it open. Even with the discussions we've had on the scripts the 8 scripts we've done so far, a lot of a lot of the people that have reached out to me have basically said, yeah, there's you guys covered it. So I mean that's pretty good, but I'm hoping for some more as things pick up, especially now that winter is kind of coming to an end, and things are going to start heating up again. Not just with the weather, but also in this type of space, especially on the YouTube side of things, uh, revenues go up as you get towards spring and summer. So people probably have a little bit more activity going on, and I'm hoping that people start having a little bit more disposable income so that they can go back to the movies and start seeing
Oh,
some more stuff. Because this year's going to be kind of slim on the tent poles, but I bet you there's going to be a lot of like hidden gems that aren't going to be as well pushed this
I
year.
know, we talked about we had a little set back and forth on Twitter where you were taught we I think anyone but you had come up, and I commented about how me and my wife went and saw it, and we just had a good time seeing it,
Hmm.
enjoyed it for what it was, and how Hollywood should be getting back in the business of mid-budget romantic comedies because they were just, speaking as someone who worked at a movie theater, they were a money printing machine. They kept movie theaters in business during the slow months because people would bring dates. It was
Hmm.
a good thing to do. And if you make ones that people are just generally satisfied with, it was good for everybody. And Hollywood needs to get back into that.
It's that's very true. And I mean anyone but you. Yeah, I had to see it. My girlfriend was interested in it. It's a very weak romantic comedy, but it's currently clocking past 200 million globally, which is a
Hmm.
huge win for for that because the previous romantic comedy I can think of had George Clooney and Julia Roberts, and that did okay, but I don't think it did 200 million.
I'm trying to remember how much Lost City made. All right, Lost City with Sandra
Sandra
Bullock
Bullock,
and Channing
Channing
Tatum.
Tatum,
Also, that came out in 2022, so that one was a fairly decently. It made 190 worldwide, so
not
uh,
bad.
not bad. That one had a much higher budget. It was like 60, 70 million because Sandra Bullock obviously commanding a bigger salary than um, Sydney Sweeney and oh, what's his name?
It's Glenn Powell. Now Glenn
Glenn
Powell,
Powell. He's on the rise right now. I think
he's
he's going
on
to
the
be.
rise, but
Yeah.
he's also probably going to be a little bit sidestepped because he did 4 movies back to back before the pandemic hit, and they're all coming out kind of back to back this year. Like
Yeah,
with
because
with the exception of course
Twisters.
Top Gun Maverick because he was featured in that. But he's got a movie that I think is going on to Netflix or Amazon that he co-wrote. So I'm hoping that turns out well for him. Unfortunately, it's not going to make really any money because it's going to be on the streaming service, so it's only going to get whatever percentage deal of subscriber retention they negotiated, if they even were smart enough to do that, because that's a whole nother whole nother bag of weeds. But I think this time next year, Sydney Sweeney will probably be getting easily $10 million a picture. Her
Yeah.
quote's going to go up like that because not only does she promote the heck out of all of her films, even Madam Web, which is shocking. I mean, I thought I'd be embarrassed about that. Um,
Can I
but
tell you
she's,
how disappointing it was to see those behind the scenes clips where Sydney Sweeney was like fighting to do comic authentic things
yeah.
in the suit? Like, I need to be in the suit. I need to come in upside down. I need to do all this stuff. And I'm like, Sony, what is wrong with you?
Well,
Like,
I've been hearing those things about her for about 2 years now. Because she hasn't really made, she only started making waves pretty recently, but I remember it was myself and former YouTuber, lovely woman Jane Theory, brought her up
Oh,
because
Jane
she's,
was awesome.
I mean, I
Yeah.
love her. She's doing her own thing right now, so I wish her all the best if she has happened to listen or what have you. But yeah, we were both talking about how, yeah, she's interesting. And then I was talking to some of my friends in the industry in LA. It's like, hey, do you know anything about her? Like, she seems to be kind of like the new it girl. And they're like saying, well, number one, she wants to be a director and a producer, so she's trying to get into that quick. And I'm like, but she's in her early 20s. And like, yeah, I know. She's clearly knows her time. Her effectiveness is limited, and but she wants to learn more about the industry. I'm like, okay, that's cool. And then they keep on saying how she's really gung ho, she's really dedicated. Any project she gets involved in, she puts in a whole amount, and that she's also really charming. I'm like, oh my god, we've got like a legit old school style Hollywood actress in 2022 at the time
Mhm.
this was, or 2021. And so I'm like, okay, I'm just going to put her on my radar. And anytime I've got a project where there could be a really fun or interesting female lead of that age type, I'm going to put her within the top 10 that I have as my
Mhm.
picks. And every single
She,
time I've sent out something that has that, I get, responses back. You know what? Yeah, Sydney Sweeney and these other girls, they'd all be perfect for this. Let's go see if they'll be interested. And, now it's the waiting game. But that's something amazing to have.
yeah, she did a really cool series of videos where I guess she restored an old Mustang. Like she was doing it herself. I was like, well, there's something you don't see. I don't know how staged it is. I feel like it was actually authentic with her though. But it
Well,
was,
the world
yeah,
will figure it out for real soon
pretty
enough.
quick. Yeah. Yeah.
But like, I'm glad that we
Speaking,
got those types of those things because, yeah, it's gonna dovetail to this. What were you saying? Sorry, I cut you off
I
there.
was I was gonna say of speaking about things that we may or may not ever figure out. I think that's a good transition to the script we read.
That's right. So let's get that started now that the fun preamble is done. Okay, still no music cue yet. Sorry, guys. I'll get to it. I'll get to it, I swear. All right. Welcome to Scripts on Saturdays, the only screenplay review show on the interwebs, discussing scripts both professional and amateur, circulating around Hollywood, giving you, the TV and movie-going audience, a behind-the-scenes and inside track on what writers are pushing and what producers are buying. I am your host, the Script Doctor, and joining me this week is Little Chad. So happy to have you here, sir.
Great to be here.
We've got a fun script.
I really enjoyed the heck out of this one.
Okay, so spoilers to the end of the show. Yeah, but
Yeah.
yes, we do have a fun one.
Yeah.
So this one it's titled Neither Confirm Nor Deny. It is from The Blacklist in 2020. So this is your peak kind of woke screenplay submission period of Hollywood. And it's written by David Collard. But even though it's peak woke stuff, I did not pick up any woke elements, and we'll get to a little bit of that later. This came in number 3 with 26 votes on the Blacklist. So, 26 very powerful producers enjoyed this script, and it might even still be in possible shopping right now. Because again, Hollywood needs to put stuff in production, and this one could be affordable. The log line for you listeners out there. It's an adaptation of David Sharp's book, The CIA's Greatest Covert Operation, that chronicles the clandestine CIA operation that risked igniting World War III by recovering a nuclear-armed Soviet sub, the K-129, that sank to the bottom of the ocean in 1968. Now, the original logline said sunk, but that's not grammatically correct, so I fixed it myself. And this screenplay may or may not have been written by the same person that wrote Annapolis. I reached out to find out, but for sure, but unfortunately my colleagues have not returned with a confirmation. Little Chad, could you please share with us the synopsis?
Sure. Yeah. In 1968, the United States stumbled upon a sunken Russian sub, the K-129, 3 miles below the water in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. With Russia having called off its search, the CIA hatches a clever plan to achieve the impossible, raising the sub off the ocean floor to learn its secrets and change the course of the Cold War. But how can a feat be achieved? How can such a feat be achieved without the Russians catching wind of it? That is the story the U.S. government can neither confirm nor deny.
All right. So I want to get your thought. You already said that you liked it.
Yeah.
So we're probably gonna know what the ending of this show's gonna be. But
Yeah, I'm sorry, I jumped the gun,
no,
but it's so
that's
nice when
okay.
you read something that's fun.
That's fun,
Yeah.
especially at a
Yeah.
time when screenwriters weren't writing stuff
Hmm.
like this.
Yep.
So please, I'm opening up the floor to you, sir. Share us your initial thoughts on Neither Confirm Nor Deny.
From a script standpoint, it flowed really well, and honestly, it was, this goes back when people who listen to my second thoughts on Madden. One of the things in the two scripts I've now been commenting on, they both flowed extremely well reading. Like you could read these well and not and they were paced well. Like it kept your attention the whole time. The formatting was really easy to follow. So from a technical script writing standpoint, as a non, professional script writer, I felt like this was a really good one for me to be able to read and just keep pace going, and I didn't have to put it down. I think it clocked about 133 pages, and it really kept my attention and had me going basically in one sitting. I was reading this thing, so I think that's a really big positive sign for the script. I think part of it is because the story is so compelling in its own nature. It's got a natural like race against the clock. You've got man versus machine, man versus nature. All these elements are just naturally inherent in the script. There's a couple areas that I think are a little weak, but nothing that kept me from enjoying what I was reading, or enjoying the plot or the ticking clock aspect of it. So I just man, I can't say that I can't believe this was written in 2020 during peak wokeness, because it seems so just legit to the time, and maybe because it's based on factual events, you can't bend it too much to make it fit a 2020 or a woke agenda, so to speak, because the people are who they are.
Hmm.
They were there. You can't really just get away with changing that. Yeah, um it just was, it was really cool to see a script like that. For me, it reminded me a lot of movies like Ford versus Ferrari, U571, you
Hmm.
know, classic, real tales of what actually happened during a crisis kind of event or time. And maybe it's just because that's in my wheelhouse of interest. I just really enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, I was as I was reading it, I was wondering, could this been one of the many CIA stories that inspired like the Hunt for Red October? The Jack
I
Ryan stuff. And
ex- I think it actually was, because Jack Ryan, not Jack Ryan, Tom Clancy, like was just animal of like consuming like information about what was really going on. And he lived, I think, in Silver Spring, Maryland, around where a lot of these people would have been. So it doesn't it has a very similar vibe, right, to to that
oh,
kind of
absolutely!
to
Like
that story.
the writer really does try to give this a breakneck pace. When I opened the script and I saw that it was 132 pages, I'm like, holy crap! No, please don't do that to me. Come on. And because it's a red flag. And for anyone out there listening, they've never written a screenplay before, they've never read one before. If you do have a script that's over 120 pages, a lot of professional producers will toss it just on that alone. And it's the basic reason is that if you can't discipline yourself to tell a story within 2 hours, you're probably not good enough to tell a story over 2 hours. Um, it's just like a basic rule of thumb. As I'm reading this, I'm like seeing a couple of, I guess the best way I could call them were like false starts. Because like the
Mm-hmm.
initial one with the Russian crew, the Russian guy, he's smoking a cigarette. It gets confiscated because he has to go board the sub, and then his commanding officer starts smoking the cigarette, and then they get in, and then we learn that the Russian fleet has gone out into the Pacific to search for the sub that hasn't checked in, and then they give up. And then we get it all in that type of Michael Bay style or John McTiernan style. Um, fast paced, chyrons on the bottom of the screen, 0800 hours, all that type of stuff. With the U.S. and their sonar net there's like state of the art sonar net that they have out there. I think they have like relay stations on the West Coast, and then other relay stations in Hawaii and whatever. I don't know all the details of it, but it's really elaborate. And basically, through their own records, they were able to detect an explosion somewhere northwest of Hawaii, I believe. And they were able to get within 5 nautical miles of where that sub had soft landed on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, 3 miles below surface level. And I'm like, that's really impressive for like 1968 technology. And it just keeps on causing me to remind myself that a lot of private technology or stuff that's been commissioned by certain government agencies is around 10 to 15 years ahead of what ends up becoming on our normal technology on the market. Like when I was in high school, one of my friend's uncles worked for Google, or sorry, not Google, Apple, and they had shipped to their home basically the largest television touchscreen I had ever seen or ever even knew of. This was in 2000. It's basically the prototype for what they ended up using on their iPhone and all their iPads and stuff. But it was like a wall television, and they were building a bunch of these, and he had one, and we came over and we got to actually like see it. And there's only a couple of programs on there that actually interacted with, because there wasn't much to do with it. It was just mostly a TV, but you could tap like a big window and then it'd be like, here's your notepad. And like, that's all it could really do. Notepad and maybe a couple of browsing if it was connected to the internet. But you're looking at an 8 by 10 foot, essentially an 8 by 10 foot iPad in the year 2000. Good 8 to 9 years before they actually came out in their normal size form. And I have to keep on reminding myself every time I see, a biopic or a script of this nature that takes place decades ago and they've got advanced technology. It's like, oh yeah, they probably did have something like that, because the need facilitated the investment. And that's what this entire script is about, is they need to build something that's never been built before to achieve something that's never been achieved before. And it's total gear porn. It's something that we don't get a lot of in movies these days.
Yeah, I really like that aspect of it. I mentioned earlier Ford versus Ferrari, and one of the things I really enjoyed about that movie is just seeing the development and iterations of the engine and building the car. And that's like, we used to get movies that kind of did a lot of that, and we don't really see that much now. And it's really fun to see like a team of people like coming at engineering problems and doing the impossible. And one of the lines that stuck out to me was like, you said, one of the guys was like, we can't do this, it's completely impractical, it's impossible. And the guy was like, is it impractical or impossible? Because those are two different things.
Well,
Like,
that's the admiral who
yeah.
he's aboard, I guess. So what ends up happening, because I want to circle back to that line, because that's part of a really interesting scene that's set up where the United States sends out a sub, the Halibut, I believe, to confirm location of this, and they find it, and they get pictures, and then the captain and the one of the engineers is there, and they're like, yeah, we found it, and we can't do anything with it. It would be great if we could actually kind of find a way to get it up. And they're discussing things about cutting it apart to, take it back in pieces. And I guess the rear admiral there is like saying, no, I want the whole thing. I want the whole kit and caboodle. And then that's where they do that line as well. It's impossible and impractical. And it's like, it's either one or the other. Figure it out, because we're doing this. And what was a little bit interesting about this is that they were fun scenes, but what was frustrating is the fact that none of these characters really do come back again. Like we're getting all these little bureaucratic.
I think, that admiral comes back, like, I think two more times in meetings, one or two more times when he's at that point elevated to being the chairman of the Joint Chiefs,
which is like 100 and some odd pages later.
Yeah.
Like I literally forgot about him. And that's one of the flaws of this script, is that there's a lot of named characters in this, and they just come and go. Like, the main character is Dave Sharp, who wrote the book that the screenplay is based off of. And he's a guy who he's got a professorship at a university after he was fired on a previous CIA project that did not go according to plan. And
so that was interesting. I felt like I didn't get a lot of, they keep referencing back to that. And it was interesting that you never seemed, I was powering through it and kind of missed it. They never really tell you what went wrong.
No.
On his previous job. And
The thing is, like, because we don't know that, we don't understand what is exactly at stake for him personally.
exactly, and that was one of the things that in these the first act, I guess you would call it,
Hmm.
establishing Dave Sharp, you meet him, you see that he's now working as a college professor and that he's been drummed out unceremoniously from the CIA, but he's jonesing to get back to do things that matter.
Hmm. And
And it
he's
cost him his marriage
cost him
and
his
all this
marriage.
stuff.
But I mean, sorry to interrupt you there, but one of the interesting things about that is he still has a very cordial and kind of positive relationship with his ex-wife. I mean, she still cares about him, and vice versa. It's just that his job at the CIA at that time that cost him his marriage was basically because of his being absent, and that
Yeah,
was it. That was the only factor.
which was interesting because they allude to it, and I liked the fact that they laid the groundwork for it because later in the second and third acts you see how much of a workaholic this man is,
Yeah,
that he can't like let things go, that he's just to the point of damaging his own physical health. And you see it's kind of a good payoff to that where you're like, okay, I can see why if I was a wife who needed a husband to help me raise a child, how unhappy I would be with someone who would be clocking those kinds of hours when they were sucked into a project.
and the
And
secrecy to it too. Like he can't even share or vent to his spouse about it when he would have the time, and that causes a huge dividing, um, you know, a huge division. Sorry, a huge division between them. And he has some interesting moments with his son too, because again, this starts in 1978, and it goes all the way to the end of the mission, which occurs in around 1975
yeah,
ish.
60, yeah, so 68 through 75 is our window because the sub went down, the Russian one in 68, and the project finishes it, but by the time Gerald Ford is president. So it runs the for those history buffs, it's basically right after Nixon's first election in 68 all the way through when he got drummed, was sent packing, resigning from Watergate, and there's an administration change. And so that is also a thing that is kind of hovering over the background in the script in the later phases.
Hmm.
So there's so many ticking clocks that are actually that were present, which is fun. Like there's nothing artificial about the fact that when an administration changed and you get whole new, swaths of leadership, they're going to look at the projects that were being done by the old guys and start saying maybe we can just cut this thing and get rid of it and we don't need to keep it going. A lot of ways it's like for Uscript it's like if a new person takes over a studio,
Hmm.
and once the new studio head comes in, he's going to look at all the things that were in development under the old leadership and say, we can send packing like 90% of these things and we're
Oh
going to
yeah,
start fresh.
if film hasn't started rolling, it's gone. Like that's pretty
Yep.
much the rule. And this one here was cool because it bounces around all to that. Like the majority of the script takes place under the Nixon administration, and for a great deal of the script, Nixon has no idea this thing is going on yet. He's concerned with his own machinations at this point. And what I liked is how they're going in stage by stage. But the other part that was kind of frustrating for me reading the script is that when they start talking about the problem, I'm like, well, I can think of two solutions right now. Like just off the bat, because I was completely unaware of this story historically. Like it just was never brought up in class at all or anything of that nature. I know some other stuff like the Philadelphia and things of that parts, but I never heard of this one here. And the first two things that I had in my mind was, well, you could use a claw technique with massive steel cables, or you could do a type of inflatable rafting, but it'd have to be a very, very dense inflatable raft, and you'd have to be pumping it full of air once you get it deflated at the bottom of the ocean, and that's going to take a massive amount of pressure, and it's also going to take weeks to do before you can actually get enough buoyancy for it to actually start to lift up, because you're looking at like a 15 million ton piece of machinery, something of that nature.
Mhm.
So those are the two ideas that came to me just as reading the script. And then what was really funny is in the script, it apparently takes Dave Sharp and them 6 months plus Dave spending the weekend with his son at a penny arcade to realize the claw technique.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Well,
and I'm not saying that I'm smarter than any of those guys. I'm definitely not, because I'd never be able to do the engineering aspects of it. But it's just like, it shows how difficult it was for them to address all the other variables going on at that point with such limited other experience in imagination and in engineering in the 60s, because it was still like a huge amount of accomplishments occurred up until that point. But some of the stuff that we've seen post that, especially for like us growing up as, you know, kids and seeing stuff on the news and cool inventions and whatnot, it kind of overstimulates the imagination to the point where you like, yeah, some of these things are a lot easier, plausible to jump to, because we have a different frame of reference than those guys that basically invented the frame of reference.
oh yeah, and there's a, you know, like when he's doing that whole segment where he comes up with the idea, I can't say I'm like, when I was initially reading, I was like, I did think that, like, why can't you just, you know, lift it? We have these things. I've seen these ships now with the giant crane attachments, you know,
Yep.
and now, like, now in my head after having read this, I was like, is that one of those things where they developed it for the military and then they licensed out the patent so they could start making their money back? So maybe that's what happened.
Well, I mean, probably. I mean, this one was. I mean, the level of cleverness, not just on the engineering feat, but also in how to hide it. I mean, this is where we get to the story where it's driven by characters, but the plot is far more of a focus, because the characters are driven to solve the problem, and the problem is the plot itself, which is how do we not only pick up this submarine at the bottom of the ocean, which is 3 miles deep, but how do we make sure we do it where the Russians can't find out? And
Yeah.
those are the things that are the priority. And so we stick with Dave Sharp. We get introduced to JP, who is kind of like the liaison between him and the CIA, kind of orchestrating all this stuff. And
And that was JP was a weird character in that he seemed to know and have all this background with everybody else, and you never get much on him, and maybe that's just the way it was.
mhm.
But and he also seems like, for the guy who's coming out and recruiting Dave and doing all that stuff later in the movie, there's a moment where he's really like a complete tool. Like, and I think, you know, when things weren't going well in the testing phase, and it's just like, you've destroyed this guy's life like once by, you know, bringing him in, doing all this stuff, and now you're going to treat he to me, he doesn't come off very well in it, but he's probably a real person, so maybe it's authentic.
Well, it's also like the responsibility of his position, right? So he's the
Yeah.
one who's saying, we've got orders to try and receive this submarine. Can it be done? And then after that little brief scene of Dave Sharp seeing his son playing the claw machine at the Penny Arcade, he says, I've checked the math and it works. And they're like, well, we need to find someone who can build it. So they go to one of the most prestigious shipyards in the country at the time, which name has escaped me at the moment. And they meet the head of that company. They're like, well, yeah, we'll be happy to help build it for you, but we need to wait for our chief engineer, who's John Graham. And he's always, whatever he's building a new boat or designing a new boat, he ends up going out to sea every once in a while to kind of work out those problems. And JP doesn't really trust him much, I think, because he's aware of him, but he also doesn't trust him because he used to be an alcoholic.
Yep, I really liked that through line,
Mm-hmm.
where that led to some really great character moments, and it was one of this movie needed humanizing moments a lot, because you're moving so fast at breakneck pace with all the real historical things that have to get done. The moments they took basically for, you know, that character, and he pulls Sharp in, you know, to the same, you know, like he ends up being involved in a lot of those too, were some of the highlights for me, because you need that human anchor, you know, the human element, you know,
Mm-hmm.
the thing to root for, the people to like. And for as fast as this movie was moving along, that character was probably, I'd say, the key to unlocking most of those moments.
Well, he was fun. Like,
Yep.
this is a guy who knows his craft so well that everybody thinks of him as a jerk because he's pretty much right 99% of the time. And the 1% he's not right comes much later in the script, and it's basically something that neither John nor Dave considered at the time, which I'm going to hold off for a bit. But I do like the fact that John is this casual guy. He's got a piece of metal that he holds and kind of rubs for security, like a security blanket. It's actually, other iterations have used this before. In fact, one particular was used in the TV series Cheers with Sam Malone, and we'll get to that a little bit later because I want more people to have leaning in more onto what we're going to be talking about. But we also get introduced to John's essentially assistant, but has the title of a secretary, and that's Candy. And Candy is this woman who she's kind of abrasive and very pretty, and that's the correct order of how you're supposed to view her. Is that she's kind of in your face first, and then you realize that she's attractive. And the script does a fun thing of saying you'd be smart to maintain that order of hierarchy in her character, because if you flipped it, you'd basically end up on your butt. And it's not like a power move; it's more like a shock and awe type of thing. And I like how she was able to balance a bunch of that together, and I like the fact that she felt like an actual character. She wasn't an object or affection. She knew her way around things. She knew why, John was right. We find out that she's always keeping an eye out on him because he has been sober for many, many years, and she's one of the people there that's trying to maintain that sobriety for John, because John did something to help her out during a tough time. So there's a deep friendship there, and Candy's one of the only people around John that can get away with saying stuff to him that other people couldn't.
I know. I liked her character a lot. She ends up having a lot of good moments with Sharp as well.
Like she starts looking out for him too, because
Yep.
this project's taking up so much of his time.
And there was not to get too far ahead, but there, like we talked about with Sharp and his relationship that went south with his wife, I think is an interesting point to say how much it was easier to have a relationship with a woman who was in on it, who was involved, and that way he didn't have to hold things back, right? And how much of that is important, because what he was doing, we never get clarification on it, but clearly what he was doing was something he couldn't talk about to his wife. She just knew that the CIA was taking him for 90% of his week, and he wasn't there to help. But in this case, when he starts developing his work relationship with Candy, and they have their bonding moments, there's not anything that they have to not talk about because they're both involved in the project.
Right.
So,
and it takes a long time for them to kind of realize there's an attraction between them. Like, there's never any adversary between them. It's all basically cordial, polite, respect. But it's just they start working together a lot. They start talking. They find not necessarily similar interests, but there's just some type of other relationship going on there. And it's really fascinating. And what's funny is that it's Dave Sharp, John Graham, Candy, and maybe JP are like the four names I remember, because I recall seeing like there's a name of Duckett, and I'm like, who the heck is Duckett? I don't remember Duckett. When did he come in? And then we got Ruggles, who hasn't been around for like 20 pages. And then there's Steve Craig, and I'm like, who the heck is Steve Craig? And I'm going back and forth trying to figure out because we're just bombarded with all these characters that they are primarily there for exposition. And
exactly.
They do push the story forward, but it just feels like there's other starting points you could get there a lot quicker and keep it focused on these four.
Exactly. Like with you could just basically do shorthand, where it was like skeptical Navy admiral.
Mm-hmm.
And did you even need to give him a name? I guess it's a name because he's a real person, but it's just like you're fitting to character types. Basically, you're the foil. You're the guy who wants to cancel it. You're the Peck from Ghostbusters. You're just there to try to keep poo-pooing on the project and to push them. And then on the other hand, it's a series of real events, so it's very plausible that he was an admiral who had a lot of questions about spending this kind of money and resources on something that was not likely to succeed.
Well, that's the big part. They design the ship, and the design is actually quite brilliant, because it looks like a normal kind of oil drill rigging ship of some type. It's like they're going after like certain nodules that are on the bottom of the ocean. Again, the name escapes me because I'm going by my notes, but I'm also going a little bit by memory.
Manganese.
Yeah,
Yeah,
manganese nodules.
yeah.
And they build this massive ship that is pretty much 4 times the length and maybe 2 times the width of the sub they're going to capture. And
And I love the description where that was all so they could build in all of the things to hide it.
yeah, it's just to build everything to hide it. And one of those is the moon pool, which is really just like opening a section of underneath the boat, flooding it up to water, and then using air pressure to keep it so it doesn't sink. And I'm like, okay, that's really pretty cool. That I've seen that stuff on cruise ships, which never.
Yeah, I
goes
love
well.
I love the line. This was another great line in the script. He's like, "Hold on, where I spend most of my life trying to build boats that don't let water in."
Yeah,
It's like, I was like that. I mean, there was definitely like, and it was clearly intentional, but the lines worked. There was good humor just from the ridiculousness of the ask, right? And that's a good way to get humor into these kinds of movies when someone is trying to do something that's just not supposed to be able to be done or is so far out of left field when the people who are subject matter experts are like, "Excuse me, you want me to put a 2 football field sized pool in the boat?" Like, what?
in the boat,
What is?
and it's not within the fuselage. It's actually going through the fuselage.
Oh yeah, and then when the part was like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna build these barges that are under the boat," and they're like, "Excuse me," it's like, "Yeah, we're gonna build the barges, then we're gonna put them underwater so that when we bring them to the other boat to connect them, people won't know what we're doing." And it's like, "Jeez, this is pretty crazy."
It's pretty crazy, but like the engineering is brilliant because I've seen some of the schematics of this, and it's like it looks like a normal boat from any other angle, but you'd have no idea that inside it could house a single submarine, and and it could either pull one up or deploy it. Like that's the one part that I thought was absolutely brilliant. Is like there's other applications to this thing, and
Yeah,
I liked how
and
they're. I mean, I like how they like Dave and John Graham. They get into an argument about an 8-degree shift on the ballast, I think it is. And Dave's like, I wanted to go to like 8.5. And John's like, oh, 8's fine. And he's like, I really would like it to do 8.5. He's like, trust me, 8's going to be perfect. And he's like, do you just not want to build it extra? He's like, yeah, I know what I'm doing. And then it comes back into play later where they're trying to get this thing done, and they're getting closer and closer to that 8-degree threshold. And Dave is just like, I really wish maybe we did do the 8.5, but let's hope that John's right. And it's like that one mistake that could have been a thing. Not to jump too far ahead, but we'll give you clarification of that later. But I like the fact that they had those discussions and arguments about the design of the boat, because one guy's doing it from pure math and theoretical, and that's Dave Sharp. And then John is like, well, my 25 years of experience is saying this is how it actually has to work. And
yeah, I loved the juxtaposition because he's also so chill about things,
yeah,
which is such an antithesis to the way Sharp is.
especially
Like
considering how much coffee and cigarettes he's got going through his veins 24/7. Like John is very, very, yeah, he's very, very subdued for a guy that's literally got caffeine for blood.
exactly. I would in my head for some reason I was picturing an actor like John Goodman for that part, and
Yeah,
just because I don't know. I mean, he's the kind of guy who's can be so easygoing and stuff, but he has that intensity. You know that he's able to do intense stuff like when he needs to, but
yep,
otherwise he's keeping it even keel. And I mean, I guess when you read scripts, it's hard not to picture the actors that you would put into that. For some reason, in my head, the pair I had was John Goodman and Bradley Cooper.
that's a
I was like,
huge age divide. But
well,
yeah,
I think but that's part of I think what's supposed to also be there is an age divide, right? I
I mean,
thought,
kind of, not too much. It doesn't seem like, at least because again, we don't really get a definitive age for John
yeah,
Graham.
yeah, maybe I was just picturing him being an older
Yeah,
because of the way they talked about how experienced he was doing it.
Well, I mean, yeah, I would get that too. But also, again, one of the biggest flaws of this script is that they introduce a lot of named characters in a cluster, and you don't know which one is actually the important one until several pages later. So now you've got your priority, your attention is split across all these other characters when it's supposed to be well delegated between the main character and the supporting characters. And the thing is, the script doesn't really give you any hints as who's the supporting character. You have to figure that out through basically scene frequency and dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, like you said, I think the order is clearly Sharp, John, Candy, JP are the only people who are pretty much there from start to finish.
Exactly.
Well,
And
even Candy was like towards the end of the first act, I guess you would say.
yes, Dave doesn't come in until like 6 or 7 pages into the script. Same with JP. All the other characters we saw beforehand completely irrelevant except for maybe the Rear Admiral, excuse me, who does come back later. And then it's then yeah, 20 30 pages later we get John Graham, and then we get Candy, and we're slowly learning that they're a bit more important and how they're being directed through this. We find out that they construct this in the San Francisco Bay Area, the fleet yards out there. So
I think it's San Diego too.
Or San Diego,
right?
sorry.
Yep.
And Dave has to relocate, so he's basically on the other side of the country, and he can't see his kid as often as he wants to.
Yep.
And we get
I was about to say,
go ahead.
'cause I live in Northern Virginia, so when they're talking about like he lived in Tyson's Corner, I mean, it's nice when you actually have a frame of reference where all these places are, and you're like, oh, okay, I know exactly where he was living, and I know exactly why he would have been living there if he had worked for the CIA, because the headquarters is right down from there. And when they relocate him, you're basically going from as far east to west as you can get, and with the pressure of the fact that he was a divorced dad who was trying to maintain his relationship with his son on every weekend. He had weekend visits.
Yep.
And that becomes a stress point for him as well.
Yeah, where he's at best being able to see his kid like once a month.
Every other week. Yeah,
like
I think
every other week or once a month.
It was going to be every other weekend. He was going to fly out from so if you're just clocking how much stress this guy must be under, every other week he would be flying west coast to east coast to just spend the weekend with his son, and then flying back, presumably on a red eye, to just start going back to work again.
Ideally, he'd be taking the Concorde, because that was in service at that time, and that would have made it only maybe a few minutes of a flight.
Yeah, and
to reduce the jet lag.
I don't know. Did we get to the part where when they come up with the elaborate cover story for what this thing was?
No, because that hasn't come yet.
It off.
That hasn't come yet because they're still figuring out all the logistics and how to build it and what's going on. But they do realize that they need to get. They come up with the cover story of the manganese nodules, and then they're like, well, what company can do that? And they said, well, there's a couple of them that can do that, but they're too small for us to be able to pull it off. But there's also
it was the opposite. He was like, all right, so if I remember now, because they find out that they have to build this boat from scratch because nobody has a boat that would work.
Right.
So the cover story they come up with is mining from the ocean floor minerals. Like basically, you're going to run instead of a mining operation into a mountain, you're going to run it from a boat, and you're going to be sucking up, and that's where the manganese nodules and things where you're going to be taking minerals and such from the ocean floor. And the problem was they said there were about 2 companies that are big and that could handle doing it, but they're public companies.
They're public companies, right?
And they were big, and so that anything like this would have to be reported to stockholders and shareholders. And they couldn't make, this would be an elaborate cover story and a lie. So if you get into a lot of trouble if you start giving shareholders false information, Disney.
Because then they would, because again, then they would sue the company, and then they'd sue the influencing powers that manipulated the company.
So the alternate solution is there's one company that's big enough to do it, but is also private. Private means they don't have to report any of this stuff. And they're like, oh yeah, who's that? It's Howard Hughes.
It's Howard Hughes, and he's in his isolationist anti-germ phase.
Yeah, this is the phase where he's moved into Las Vegas, where he owned most of the Vegas Strip.
Yeah.
And he was living like in his, like you said, germaphobe, Just crazy phase. If you remember, if you've seen The Aviator, like it's the very tail end where he's stopped being able to function around people.
He just couldn't handle it. But the other part too is they also had to get a smaller construction company named Glomar Explorer, because that was also private, and that could facilitate the labor. And it's all being paid for by the United States government. And the reason is they reach out to Howard Hughes is they don't want him to actually spend a dime. They just want to use him for a cover story. And we have this very fascinating scene in a hotel room where Howard Hughes is not present. It's just a bunch of representatives. And the phone would ring every once in a while, and then the representative would answer it, listen, hang up, and then he'd say conditions as to what is required from the government in order for them to do this. And I think it was either JP or Dave asking, so, like, is Howard got this place bugged or something? And he's like, what are you talking about? And then they're all like, what are you talking about? No.
One of my favorite thing with that is I was like, okay, we'll do it, but the phone rings, but it needs to be it was going to be named the Glomar Hughes Explorer
Yep.
because it was the combination, and they're like, we'll do it, but it needs to be the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Like he's so, even in all this germaphobe isolationist not talking to people, he's like, I want my name first.
And the guys are like, done. No, not a problem.
And then he also asked for the production contract to build the specialized wiring
Right.
piping, as they that they said that would be needed to actually pull this thing, the crane game, from the ocean floor, which by the way probably made Hughes like, I think they said it was going to cost $380 million in 1968 dollars to do this. And so Hughes probably got a good 100 million of that in contracts for his company to make that piping.
It was not just make the piping, they had to color it as well, because, and this is the part that I thought was really great, and I like the fact that it was attributed to John Graham, and that is they colored the piping for a couple of really fun reasons. And it's a great setup because it's them thinking like 5 or 6 steps ahead, because it's not enough that from satellite imagery or overhead flying or helicopters that you cannot see this boat pick up the sub. You also have to account for any divers underneath, that even though they're not able to see 3 miles down to the ocean, they're still going to be able to see maybe 100 feet or so underneath the boat. And you have to find a way to hide a submarine going inside there in that region.
Yep.
And it comes down to the colored boats. So they're exploring all these possible situations. They're taking the same approach to this as what NASA did when they were making the lunar excursion module and the whole Apollo mission, which is like, okay, we know how to get them up there. Now we got to put them through every scenario we can imagine that they would face that could jeopardize their lives, so that we can design accordingly to cover that situation. And they pretty much did, except for the one little incident of Apollo 13. But all the other designs that they came up with helped facilitate the needs to save that crew so that they can come back home. And now we have another engineering team doing the same thing, but now instead of it for being space, it's underwater.
Here's an element that it's weird. It just hit me, and it's a weird thing. Their goal was to bring up the sub intact. That means they had all those bodies on board. It's kind of disturbing. Didn't even think about it till now. It's just
well, I mean, it's one of the things that we can get to towards the end of the script. Which,
Yeah.
But yeah, they're bringing the whole thing up. So any bodies on there, they're going to be there. They're going to be somewhat preserved by the salt water,
Yep.
and whatever state they are. And by the time they get to construction, it's pretty much been a year and a half. Like we're approaching the 1970 New Year here, where they're getting all these deals, they're getting the cover story ready, and then everybody moves out to the West Coast and they start construction, and the bills just start racking up. And it's
I also liked the beat where when Sharp arrives out. So Sharp arrives to the West Coast, and he's getting a tour of the cover facility, followed by the basically entryway into the real facility. Like the CIA has built like the cover office,
yep,
and then they have the entry point into the like CIA portion of the office.
which is like something out of Get Smart, like hidden wall stairways.
Exactly.
Some of the people are like, "Oh, this is really cool," and like the experienced guy starts just scoffing at him. It's like this
Yeah.
is just standard
But
stuff.
the best, the funniest beat from that, and it was a good comedic beat, was when Sharp gets out there, the CIA fixer hands him keys to a brand new Corvette, and he
Yeah, he's
goes,
like, you're
"Well,"
the head of a company now. You have to be driving a fine
he
vehicle.
said, "You're supposed to be the head of one of Howard Hughes's, conglomerate companies. There's no way you'd be driving like a Pinto." And then the other CIA guy who's out there, so what did I get? And he's like, you get the Pinto.
Yeah, you're nobody. You get the Pinto,
Exactly. It
and
was,
it's. I mean, it's really charming. It's good fun stuff here, and it's coming from a character that is like the no nonsense, CIA and army or military liaison. Um,
and I liked it because that's the way to put humor into this kind of script, right? Because it's from like you're in an absurd situation. You make the joke from the situation. You don't have to force like Marvel humor or anything like. I mean, it's gonna be funny because it's gonna naturally land for people because at this point you've been with Sharp enough that you know the kind of person he is that it's something he would never probably go out and buy a Corvette
no,
ever.
no,
So
he
it's
actually
just
had a
like
Pinto
so,
when we first meet him.
yeah,
Like,
exactly. So it was a perfect, it's a perfect situational humor beat, and I appreciate when scripts have that instead of kind of like forcing, whimsical, satirical, like sassy humor from just dialogue.
yeah, it
So
was very naturally done, and because it was a proper setup, a little bit of a distraction, which is like you're not driving a Ford Pinto. What? Well, why not? Because you're the head of this division. We're giving you the Corvette, and then the other guy who's like his below is like, well, what am I gonna get? You're getting the Pinto. Like that just comes right around again. It's
yes,
perfectly organic. It's fun, and then after that we get into some decent gear porn and engineering talk and some back and forth on budget, and then we get the red herring of the Watergate scandal because again it's around
72 at that point.
1972 at that point. Like Nixon has already won re-election, and the investigation into the Watergate burglary is starting to actually reveal deeper issues, and that's starting to go towards the press. And
At the should we also mention at this point, once they make the public announcement of the cover story,
mhm,
we have a cut in the script to a Soviet who is ostensibly the foil, like the person working in the Soviet regime who has figured all this out. Like he's got like they have a the scene cuts to him with news clippings of all the Howard Hughes stuff
yes,
because yeah, and he's and magically and he might maybe there was a real Soviet person who did, but magically he's put together that this is clearly an operation to recover the submarine.
oh
This is
yeah,
all
he
this is all for show.
he's this really creepy genius Russian intelligence agent who he's described as the type of guy who doesn't play the politics well enough, and that's why he's got such a low rank. But he's absolutely brilliant, and he literally does piece all those news reports together and the spy information he's able to get on the Americans about certain people moving in certain places and certain funds coming up and certain things being built. And he just puts it all together and says, this is exactly what they're doing. They know where the sub is. They're going to try and raise it. And his superior is saying that's impossible. And he's like, they don't think it's impossible. They're doing it. And it goes up a little bit. It gets knocked down because nobody in the Soviet intelligence or even in the military or Navy thinks that can be done. They think he's just a crazy nut job who happens to be on payroll. So it just goes away. And as more information comes out through articles and stuff, and also through monitoring the construction of the ship and everything, he is more and more certain that that is exactly what the Americans are doing. And we get the dramatic irony because we're like, here's this one Russian guy who knows exactly what's going on. We know he knows exactly what's going on, and nobody in Russia wants to acknowledge it. And it's like, wow, how lucky, how lucky is the United States right now?
Yeah, and it's I don't know. Like, I don't know whether this is an amalgamation of Russian intelligence people who, because the scripts will often do that in a
Hmm.
real, and when it's a historical fiction or not historical, when it's a historical event, they will consolidate characters into one person so that you don't, like we've talked about, the one of the problems of the script is all the massive number of people we're meeting and then are leaving. So they'll consolidate into one person so you can have a consistent person there in that role. So I'm pretty sure that in real world there was probably many Soviet intelligence people who suspected and were leading, were put, saying that. But in the for the script's sake, they've consolidated into this one person to basically be the anti-Sharp, right? We
Yep.
have in the script even mentions that he's basically supposed to be like the mirror universe of Sharp. Like he's
And
got the
it's
same drive
same drive,
and capabilities, but he's just in Soviet Russia and is evil that way.
so evil that he eats the core of an apple. And
Yeah.
like to your point, they may have consolidated all those agents into one character. And here I am thinking, I really wish they did that on the U.S. side of things because holy crap, way too many other characters.
I think, and part of that might be because of familiarity. So if you're somebody like me, I grew up in Northern Virginia. I've been, my family's got a military background. I'm very familiar with the apparatus and functioning of the U.S. military. So the idea of any one person in this timeline being involved from start to finish just doesn't work
Right.
because like we started in 1968, like when we talked about the head of the Navy became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Your term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, it's a rotating thing every couple of years, and then you move on, and then you're gone. You generally retire after you're chairman of the Joint Chiefs. You retire. So, in this case, it makes perfect sense that we'd have all, for somebody like me, if I saw the same like like person running the Navy from 1968 through 1975, it would be a red flag.
Hmm.
Like that's not how like it's like when people see Top Gun Maverick who have military background, you're like, how in the heck he was in the military, he was in the Navy aviator in 1986. How is he still a naval aviator in 2021?
Yeah. How does he still have the rank
It
of captain after 30
yeah,
years? How many
yeah,
disciplinary things has he had?
yeah.
And they basically just say, oh, Val Kilmer.
Yeah. The only people who are still in the military after 30 years tend to be like flag officers, admirals, generals, you
Yep.
know, they get to be, exempted from physical,
Well, they're not
fitness
there to be
testing and
like
all this.
essentially on the front line. They're there in
Exactly.
logistics and training capacity
Yeah.
to share
And
their experience.
yeah, and so it was, so stuff I think, and if this is the same writer who did Annapolis, if because we haven't confirmed that, but it
Right.
would be someone who may have previously familiarized himself with kind of the military. It's something where you can kind of get away with it in Russia because most of the audience, the Western audience, isn't going to know how the operational function of Russian intelligence and all this other stuff went. But you're going to have a large segment of the population who may have operational knowledge, so to speak, of how the U.S. military works. And so you can't get away with it as much.
Well, I
So,
mean, in that regard, you can't, but you could have another character like the JP character. He's a liaison, so he could speak on behalf of what he's dealt with, whoever is on the
yeah,
military side of things, and it's all channeled through him, as opposed to constantly bringing in these admirals and whatnot, and just parsing them all out. There's a way to consolidate it all, where it's like, okay, how can it be authentic? Well, if this guy, again, if they have operate in cells, which is essentially what the case is because of a rotating staff, and also they don't want enough people having the entire chain of information in the event that they could be captured or killed, especially on their own soil, which, there are rumors that certain accidents occurred with military operations before they actually took place. You do that for protection. So in which case you'd be like, okay, so I'm JP, I'm the guy who I'm coordinating with between the construction team here, the engineering team, and the Pentagon. So I'm the guy. So anytime I'm hearing something from a general, instead of showing a scene where he's talking to 3 or 4 different generals or admirals, it's just like he just walks in. He's like, "This is the latest report here. You're over budget. They want to cancel you, cancel this project. We are flying to Washington for you to basically give a speech as to why we should still be there. In which case, then you can have those admirals in the boardroom, but they don't have to say anything because they're just day
yeah.
players."
They should have had, yeah, and that's where you could go with it. You basically use civilian leadership within the DoD, Department of Defense, and you could get like you know fairly high up, especially someone like that might be in charge of overseeing one of these programs.
Like an
That's gonna
assistant to the assistant deputy director or tertiary director of a
exactly.
department.
Yep.
Absolutely,
A-
yeah.
And those are civilian employees at that point, not military
Yeah,
appointment.
and yeah, they're civilian employees. They're not politicians, not necessarily bureaucrats, and they're not military.
And
So
that would have been, and actually, I feel like that might be, a pretty good, solid improvement on the script because that could have been someone who was in from the 1968 phase arguing against it,
mhm.
and that way you have the running person who's always been against this project and sees it as a waste and a brown, it gives them like the Javert
Yeah.
against the project, like where he was, this person was personally offended that they were like not listened to when it got approved. And so they're making it their point. And that happens in government. They're making a point of trying to nitpick every false start or problem it has to try to get it canceled. It would have been, and then you could have a person that you can recognize and not have to remember all the names.
I mean, we do kind of get that. We get Henry Kissinger, who is definitely in that area for quite a long time in various capacities. But he doesn't say anything. He's just there. Like we don't have the impersonation opportunity for Henry Kissinger in this script, but he is kind of the guy that sort of nudges any of those that object away from confirming their objection, so that this project can still go underway. And then it gets all the way up to Nixon, who basically says it's a go. And then we find ourselves in the testing phase. And during this testing phase, where they're doing all the stuff in dry dock and then doing getting all that top that there, we start noticing that John Graham is looking really, really run dry. Like Dave Sharp's not doing too well, but John Graham is like losing weight. He looks like crap. He's really, really private about what he's doing, to the point where people are following him to make sure he's not going into a bar because they're worried about that alcoholism. And the reveal is that he's got cancer and he's going to chemotherapy at weird hours because that's the only time he's got available to get treatment so that he can last longer. And this goes into one of the scenes that you really wanted to talk about, so I'm going to let you take that away and share
Yeah,
with the audience.
so we're now in I would say this is the tail end of the second act,
Yeah.
probably. We've got Sharp making the discovery that he's got cancer and he's been going to chemotherapy, and this leads to a really great scene of bonding where he looks at him out. He's coming out of chemotherapy and he's like, "Oh, I guess you caught me. You're you're like you thought I was drinking, but and he doesn't make a. It's a. I think this is where he's such a charming character. He he sees Sharp there, and he's not like upset that Sharp followed him. He makes a joke about, I guess, if this doesn't work out, you can always be a PI,
Yeah.
which was a good, like, it's a nice joke because they don't like this isn't a point where Graham's angry that Sharp followed him or anything, and so Sharp, they have the genuine character moment where Sharp says he's sorry because when he knows now he has cancer and he's probably, I mean, in the if you're doing chemotherapy in that era, it's the odds are not as friendly
No.
as they've gotten. And Graham accepts it, and then Graham looks at him and is like, "Hey, let's play hooky. Let's go have a fun day, right? Like we're
Hmm.
this is kind of a big heavy moment." And so Graham takes him. He's a sailor, right? He builds ships. He has his own boat. So he takes Sharp out, and there's a joke where Sharp is terribly seasick. Like
Yeah.
he
It
doesn't like being
debilitates
on
him.
boats. And so as Graham is taking him out on this boat, Sharp the is like throwing up over the side, and he's laughing. They're having a good time. They get to the point where they're just having chill time, and they're talking, and he makes Sharp's like, "I'm sorry about all this," and Graham's like, "This is the best day I've had in forever. Watching you just throw up over the side of my boat. It's been hilarious. I think we're gonna." And then Graham finally, because you talked about it, the part where Sharp had suggested adjusting the tolerance to 8.5 from 8, and Graham had kind of just blown him off, and they've had a setback with the testing, one of the main systems they need to work wasn't working. And Graham looks at Sharp and is like, "We need to get. How about we get back to the office and we figure this out together?" And it
Yeah.
was the part where Graham is now opening up. He clearly at this phase he's probably expecting that thing. He doesn't have a lot of time to get this right left, and so he's gonna bring this guy Sharp in to help him, and then Sharp acknowledges, "Is this your way of asking?" He's like, "Yeah, let's go do this." And so they're gonna work together to because both of them are on the line. Like for Graham, this is gonna be the last thing he does. It's his legacy. It's the big moment of his life, right? He shares the story, and this was a touching that he talks about his dad, who was an oil man
Yep.
and
An oil
drilling.
man in Texas that
Yeah,
found a dry well.
yeah, and his dad had sunk all his money and all this stuff into it, and it didn't work out. And his dad had looked at him and it was like, "Well, that's how it goes. Sometimes you get oil, and sometimes you get mud." And it was just like matter of fact, like don't let this isn't. His dad didn't let it like destroy him. He was just like, that's how it works.
That's how it
This
works.
is
Yeah.
that's how it works." And that's how his attitude was about getting cancer. It's like, look, don't feel bad for me. It's like, that's how it works. We're gonna do this. Let's go fix this stuff, and we'll get it right.
And
And I think it's a good part because it sets Sharp up for taking on the responsibility when the program's really on the line. And I think that you can see how this kind of story beat makes him want to take that extra risk when it comes up as a thing late, fairly quick after this scene.
oh yeah, because I mean, they're coming up to the wire and they have a deadline. There's a small, very short window in the summer, in the following year that they have to go out to get this, and then if they don't get it, they have to wait a whole another year.
Except now they've moved it up now because, and this is where Watergate comes into play. Everybody in DC knows that Nixon is on borrowed time now.
Yep.
There's gonna be like he's either gonna be impeached and removed, or he's gonna. No one anticipated resignation, but when you're in that kind of situation, there's gonna be a new administration, even though it's a continuity type one where in this case Ford took over from being vice president for president.
Hmm.
But it's still like when the new guy comes in, everything gets looked at and probably gets canceled because now this was a program that was ostensibly almost 6 years into development and hadn't had any results and was testing poorly in front of key personnel. It was going to be on the chopping block. And in fact, it basically was. And so they either had the choice of taking it and doing it that year, 1 year ahead of schedule, or it just never happening.
And the problem that they had to face was basically the hatch for
The
capturing
boom,
and
yeah,
releasing the submarine. It basically was on sliding giant doors that with like 9 foot thick steel, and it's grinding together and it's tearing up the threading of some of the cogs and whatnot, and they just can't figure out how to do it. And because this test goes so terrible, Dave has to make a case in front of the brass to take it on course because they're going to solve it. Like he's saying that they're going to solve it and they're going to get it out on time. And it takes basically his speech, JP backing him up, and Henry Kissinger to basically just say, all right, we're gonna commit to it. And what's funny is after he does that, he goes into the shower just to kind of like get his bearings, and then he comes up with the idea, the solution, and he calls Graham and he's like, at the bottom rolls of the shower door, why don't we just build something like that for the hatches? Could that work on that scale? And Graham just says this really clever things like, did you just jump out of the shower, sit down, and call me? He's like, I'm not sitting down.
I'm standing.
I'm standing. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a great that again, situational comedy works great for this kind of, and it's a story beat that makes you laugh, and it's good. And
And it's amazing. And then what ends up happening is like they get told that there might have to be a delay. And the reason they get told there might have to be delays because Nixon's going to Russia. He's got a type of summit happening there. and they don't know what's going on until they get a communique that says, "Yeah, you can't go until after this date." And it's like, oh, so basically while Nixon is on the plane, Air Force One, flying back to the United States, that's when they launch. And
Hmm.
it takes weeks for them to get out there, or a week or so to get out there, I think. And then it takes days for them to get positioned, and then days to get set up. And it does take quite a long time for them to pull this thing up there. But they can't use. There's so many stipulations in place. Like the first part is that it can't be crewed by the United States Navy, so they can only have a couple of proxies there, and the proxies are not ideal because they don't know how to dress like civilians. They dress all the same, and khaki pants and like a blue collar shirt and a hard brimmed hat, and they get mocked relentlessly by the other sailors and by the other guys in the CIA, who's like, why don't we just advertise that they're in the Navy with a flag or something? Uh, and it's really quite funny. But the other part too is that they're not going to have any support. So there's not going to be any ships near the area where if they get intercepted by a Russian submarine or a destroyer or any type of vessel, they're on their own.
Yeah, I loved the commentary about how because of the cover story, when they asked like what happens if Russians try to board you. Well, we're supposed to be a civilian boat, so we will try to use water hoses to keep them at bay until until the Navy can come assist us. And then the description of like the hearing of the people hearing that was their solution was pretty funny. And
And then they're like, but we also bought several cases of vodka. So
yeah, and
ideally that's what they'll find, look for, and take, and leave us alone.
yeah, and with sharp, and with this updated timeline and things at this point have now not been um tested, completely. You're just having to go for it. And so this is another one of those natural ticking clocks, right?
Mhm.
You don't need to manufacture anything to make this a deadline that got moved because history took care of it with Watergate and Nixon, right? So it's like, all right,
Here we
you
go.
you got to do it now or you don't. And then now at this point we're cutting back now to our Russian foil who has figured out that things are moving because he's getting the reports that the boats are going out, and so he's now using, I guess, his by I guess he was threatening his superior.
He forged his
Well,
superior's signature on a
yeah,
report to get things moving again. And the superior gets so upset that he's like, you better hope we find something or it's both our butts. And he's like, we'll find something. And they don't quite intercept the ship, but one of the ships that's nearby has a helipad and a helicopter. And they send a helicopter over to the Hughes Glomar Explorer. And John is back on stateside because he can't travel because of his chemotherapy. And Dave, who is notoriously seasick, is basically the man in charge. And there's no military personnel on this vessel to help him
yeah.
out. It's all sailors and crew workers. Just they all have minimal knowledge of what they're actually doing, but it's just enough to get the job done. And as soon as they learn, as soon as they open up the gates and they start feeding through the pipe, which is it's 3 miles of pipe and it's 4 cables in total, I believe it is,
Hmm.
and it's attached to what they call Clementine, which is the claw apparatus. And I've always thought, okay, that's a funny name. My Clementine is going to grab this sub from the bottom of the ocean. Clementine has 16 tines to it, like big legs that
Hmm.
are supposed to dig into the ground underneath the sub so that it can pull it up along with a little bit of the core. And in order for them to affix this, they have to first get the cables in there, then they have to affix the cables to Clementine, and then they got to lower it down section by section, and it takes hours to do because these cables are incredibly heavy, and it's done through robotic arms that are controlled from inside the boat in order to move this stuff because it's too heavy for physical people to do it. But there's divers underneath that are bolting it together as each section comes down, so it has to have a physical element to it as well. And the divers underneath, they're not so deep that they can't see and hear the helicopter overhead, which freaks everyone out. And so Dave gets the idea of like put as many crates on the helipad so it can't land. And they just rush all these crates out there. So the helicopter is circling around, and they're exchanging sign language of sorts
Yeah.
until the Russians come back, and then they're getting radio signals. In which case they're just saying like, yeah, we're a civilian boat and what have you. And it's a back and forth, and the captain on the Soviet is like, there's nothing there, we're going back, but they're getting orders like, nope, you're going to ram it. You're going to ram that boat because we are so certain that they're trying to steal our sub. We want to make sure that they can't move, that they have to move. And so now we get another ticking clock situation, which is they're looking at their scope with the boat bearing towards them, and they haven't fully secured the Clementine yet in order to move the ship away so that it doesn't drift or go off course. And they are screaming back and forth at each other saying, like, we both have engine trouble. We can't move. Like, we're barreling towards you. We can't slow down. Yeah, well, we can't move because our engines are not working right now either. We've got a repair crew on it. It's like, well, surely you can. And it gets closer and closer and closer. And it's really well written and laid out. And you're building up to the suspense. And then at the very last minute, they get the last pin in. They're able to release so that they can move the Hughes Glomar Explorer. And just at the same moment, the Soviet vessel alters course just enough so that they literally like feet apart from each other. And I was doing some research on this after the fact, and apparently while these two boats were kind of crossing paths, some of the crewmen on either boat decided to drop their pants and moon the other. So that ended up happening, and because the Hughes Glomar Explorer moved, when the captain of the Soviet vessel reported that the ship moved, they were sent back to port. They're like, okay, retreat. And when word got back to that part, they're like really kind of upset. However, everything's kind of going according to plan. They managed to get Clementine around. They had issues getting the tines underneath the soil, breaking the soil so they can get underneath the submarine, but they finally did. And as they're slowly pulling it up, another explosion kind of goes off. And it's not an explosion on the sub. It's actually one of the tines, or a few of the tines on Clementine, breaks off because even though it's very, very strong steel, other factors were at play that caused it not to be as strong. And because of that, a majority of the sub breaks off and drops, and the Soviets hear it.
Yeah.
And so they send out another boat with divers this time. And this is where the brilliance actually comes into play. And I was not expecting this, but I thought it was absolutely amazing. And that is, as they're bringing up the boat, as we said earlier on, they painted a lot of these cables. And they painted them yellow, red, and blue. And the blue ones are the ones that are basically the first ones out there. So they're the ones closest to the submarine. And then you get the yellow, and then you get the red. And as they're pulling this up, there's not much they can really do when they realize that the Russian boat is there with the divers. So they stop everything and they just kind of hold their breath. And the divers come out and they take a look. And what they see is a large manganese nodule collector attached to these 4 thick yellow cables that are going up to these red cables that are going up to the boat. And they don't see the blue cables underneath that are kind of disappearing in the depths of in the dark of the ocean that's holding on to Clementine, which is holding on to the submarine. They can't see it. It is camouflaged in. And it's basically a callback to a World War II maneuver where they used inflatable artillery and tanks to fool the enemy into thinking that the Allies had a larger tank force on the ground than they actually did. And that is something that John Grant came up with. So the fake manganese module collector was actually just an inflatable balloon that was getting pumped air from the vessel above to make it look like it was real, and it fools the Russians. And they say there's nothing there. There's just the thing that we reported on their tests that our spies saw earlier. We're going back, and that ends up working. And when they finally pull up what they have with the submarine, it's basically less than a third of it. But it's still significant because they've got journals. They find 6 bodies on there. And when they make their way back to Hawaii, they're basically saying, we're once we get back to port, we're going to do some repairs. We're going to get things sorted out. And then we're going to head out for next year to go get the rest of the sub. But once they get back to port in Hawaii and they do a respectable Soviet service to bury those 6 officers at sea, and they videotape it, or not, well, they film it because they didn't have really videotape in 75, at least in the same way that we recognize it in the 80s and 90s. When they get that done, they get a report back from Washington saying, yeah, you're not going back out again. Sorry, it's a one and done. Just bring in what you got. We'll do what we can. And everybody is completely disappointed. And rightfully so. They spent 5 to 6 years working on this project. They managed to pull off the impossible. They know they could go back and get it, but they just don't have the opportunity. And instead of sulking about it, Dave takes a page out of John Graham's book, and he basically reminds them that, number one, they achieved the impossible. Number two, the newspapers got wind of this, and they're going to leak the story. And when they do, Russia's going to know, and Russia will have to then redesign and re-engineer their entire fleet with new technology and new codes, which will set them back years and give the United States a huge lead on technology and upgrades of their own vessels. That'll basically help facilitate a resolution to this Cold War. And in one area of it, he's not wrong, because it's only about 15 years later does it end.
Yep.
And part of that has to do with the fact that they were able to crack a lot of Russian codes, and the Russians weren't able to update their codes or change them fast enough that they couldn't be re-cracked. And then, of course, their entire siege into the Middle East that Russia was doing, which is coming at great expense, and all that type of stuff. Not in the script, but it's just a factor that played into ending the Cold War. All kind of has a pivotal moment at this point here. So what did you think about that resolution and how it kind of tied in to to that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, it's true to history, right? It is. I mean, it is what happened. You know, that it did get leaked out. There is a lot of debate about how much of the sub they actually got. That seems to be a point of contention.
Mm-hmm.
But man, it's and it leads into the title, right? Because this was the resolution comes. The title of this movie, as you know, on the script, it comes from what had to come out after the leak to the press, right? You know, like, we can neither confirm nor deny
the events that being reported as true. Yeah.
Yes. Hypothetically, if this did happen, anything involved would be classified, and we couldn't speak to it. So,
and it's the first. It's the first official type of statement from the CIA.
Yeah, because this is the first time the CIA I'm doing air quotes, got caught doing one of the things they were not supposed to be doing. And obviously because the cover story had been so public, like ridiculously public, like Howard Hughes people doing press conferences public, it's even harder to kind of just sweep it under the rug. But I mean, I liked the resolution because it didn't feel contrived. It felt real, because it was real, effectively, right? So and not every and they set it. I do love how they seem to set things up very well in the script. It's always good to have callbacks, like, and that's where sometimes you get mud, sometimes you get oil.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're setting up the fact that, and I think this is important, because if you look at it for Sharp's character arc, he's a workaholic. He can't let things go. Clearly, failure had destroyed him when he got fired from the CIA the first time. And in this case, I think Sharp in whatever he gets into, page 5, wherever his introduction was, that Sharp would have been crushed by what happened.
Yeah.
Whereas the Sharp we get by the end of the movie is like, no, look at all the things we're going to get out of this. This is going to be a win. It's a win, and I'm happy with it.
Yeah, it's not the win they were hoping for, but it's still a win that has significant. It basically comes with the same type of consequences for for the enemy as what if they got the full sub or not. Because again, they can play he plays up to the fact that Russia doesn't know how much we retrieved, so they have to do all of it. That it's the only logical step. And then of course, oh yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say it's actually more of it's an optimum one because it causes more confusion, right? One of the things you always want to do is cause your enemy to be confused and to always be working from a position of not of being uninformed, not having the information. If the Russians knew they had gotten the entire sub, they could immediately act on knowing that. But now they're in a position of almost like a Schrodinger's cat. Like they have to act as if they got nothing and everything at the same time. Like it's almost worse because you're going to have people in Russia arguing, no, they didn't get any of that. We can just work. It causes more disunity, more
And
problems.
bureaucracy. Yeah, that's the other part.
In a bureaucracy like that, you're going to get more issues coming from maybe they didn't get everything than everybody agreeing they got everything. So you could argue from an actual logistical standpoint, as an operation, it's more successful by not getting everything because they don't know what they got. And that's where I think Sharp at the end of the script sees that, like, versus the Sharp at the beginning who would just see failure.
And the same thing would be with JP because JP fired him in that first part. And, to roll back a little bit, JP kind of fires
him
again, but John Graham, who's the head
Saves
engineer,
him.
says, then I'm going to resign if you get rid of him.
That was another great line. In the spirit of accountability, I quit.
Yeah.
And that's when JP immediately turns around. Sharp, you're rehired. It's like, it was great because that's another moment where you can see how much Graham actually likes Sharp and has grown fond of him in a workplace way, and that he's gonna and also this is a thing where they give you the cues throughout the script through his loss of weight, and they have some of the coughing fits and other things, and these are traditional script cues to show someone has a very serious illness.
Mm-hmm.
Another example that comes to mind is if you ever see someone cough blood into a handkerchief, they've got tuberculosis. And if that,
Most likely,
I don't know.
yeah.
Yeah, because if they show that in a movie scene, that's wasted real estate unless it's going to pay off that they have something, and that's a classic symptom. It's like I remember when I watched Moulin Rouge with someone for the first time when we were screening it for the theater. As soon as Nicole Kidman did that, I was like, "She's dead. She's got tuberculosis." And she's like, "How did you know that?" And it was like they showed a handkerchief with blood. She's gonna die.
Yep.
You're gonna be fine. And so in this case, they're giving you a cue. So this is a great point where Graham is working from the I don't give an F because I've got my ticking clock from nature.
Yeah.
So it was good that he was using that to help Sharp out. And yeah, so all of these guys having gone through this journey to see how much effort and work and genuine, even though it was limited, success that they did get, I thought was a great moment for all of them. And obviously the script at the end when they go to share the news with Graham. And
they learned the tragic news that he passed away while the mission was going
up. Yeah.
But he was so smart enough to think of enough contingencies that it wouldn't have made it this far without him.
Yeah. So that was, one of those things where it's the bittersweet end, that where it's one of the characters you really liked. And it's just how, it's going to go. Like sometimes you get mud and he's going to be, gone before you can tell him your successful story. Right. And obviously we get the flash forward at the very end, I guess it would be another couple years. I'm trying to think, cause they said his son was 17 in in that last scene.
Before he goes on to the mission, he goes to visit his son one last time.
And I think he was 15 in that.
I think he was like around 15 in that, and he goes there because Candy convinces him to go, even though he's like, I don't even know my kid anymore. I've missed so much time. I love him to death, but I just can't bear to do it. And she's just like, if you don't come back, I mean, he's gonna be upset. And the other part, he's gonna be upset. But even though, like, Dave is thinking that he's a terrible father, he's doing more than what most fathers in an absent situation do anyways. So, and that's what Candy does to support him for it. So he ends up going back to Virginia, and he ends up just playing basketball with his kid, and they get that last bonding moment. And before he leaves the bay aboard the ship, he's talking with Candy, and they finally like kiss for the first time. And what's funny is that I think Dave says, "Is this my promise to come back?" or something of that nature. And and it ends up working out because we get, the ending with all the cryons and all that stuff, and Dave and Candy wed after a few years, and they stayed married until she passes away in like 2018 or something of that nature.
Yeah, and it was I liked ending on that, and because in the end this is a human story about people working to do this thing with Sharp as your main through line character. So it's because I like the idea that in the end he did the job, he was happy, it was successful to what it needed to be, but for him he's seeing like the value of just his relationship. I mean, it's hokey and everything, but it worked for me. It worked for me to as a good end cap for this story, to just have a father and son, and in this case, Candy was in there as well, and kind of coming full circle for him, where he was dysfunctional at the beginning. You're seeing the what is it? The old movies like Show Don't Tell.
Yep.
You're seeing in this scene a visual representation of his character growth, where he's spending time, his relationship with his son is working, he's got a healthy positive relationship with his new partner, with Candy, and you're seeing it on screen visually representing the journey he went through by going through and doing this crazy, like no one would believe it kind of thing. He's a better person at the end of it.
And okay, so with that, little Chad, share your obvious answer with the audience. Would you give this a green light or a pass?
I would give it a green light. I think this is the kind of movie that could do really well. Like, because it's just, again, Ford versus Ferrari. It's the
Mhm.
kind of movie that would just get the, I don't want to, I hesitate to say, but this is a movie that speaks to the male audience really well. Like, I feel like you want to know your audience. This is the male moviegoer is going to eat this up and would love the heck out of it.
And
I think,
it's not averse to the female audience either. Like that's the
no,
other part too. I'm in the same boat. But mine is like it's a
pun
really
intended.
pun intended, but it's also really touch and go because again, this script is a good 15 to 20 pages, way too long, and it's a little messy in some parts. The only thing that keeps it focused is the fact that the clear goal is they got to get this sub. And if they didn't have that clear goal established, this would be one of those types of really red herring, confusing political thrillers that you kind of see on the B movie side, or the push tentpole that doesn't make like what was it, White House Down or something of that nature.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I feel
because
like real quick, just that entire opening sequence with the Russians,
mhm.
I would kind of cut or rework to something much. I feel like if you just jump to the American, you know, defense bureaucracy finding out the Russians lost the sub, you're perfectly fine.
I
I
would
don't think.
say, yeah, I would say you could find the sub. You could then do the JP and Dave reunion, and then I would go straight into, well, we know how we're going to do it, and basically make it a bit more of a conflicting scene where Dave is presenting his claw maneuver to a board that is basically telling him, you spent the last 6 to 8 months coming up with a freaking claw game that my kid goes to on Saturdays. Like, just to jump ahead of that part here, because and I also think that there's a lot of excitement in the writer when he was writing this, because there are parts in the script around like the 40 page to 50 page mark where we're clearly established in 1972, and then we kind of jump back to 1971, and then back to 72, and it's
Yeah,
like you're doing a
he
flashback within a period piece where you're doing a lot of time jumps ahead, and now you're doing one back, and it's like throwing me off. And it's really weird, but it's also kind of hurting the flow, because they're leading up to the Watergate scandal, and then they jump back a year in the past, really just for one scene, and then jump ahead.
Yeah, there's definitely like there is fat to be trimmed that will kind of streamline this and get it into a tighter shootable script.
Right.
That
Absolutely.
will be that, and it still leaves the core functional movie that it is very enjoyable. Like if I like you were talking about, I would cut out the part at the beginning where with the Russians and the first scene of the movie for me would be JP coming to recruit Sharp, and have JP be your exposition dump about the Russians losing a sub. You can cut out all that. That's a good 5 maybe 10 minutes of movie that you can now just move right into.
Hmm.
And I would even say that initial meeting with Sharp and his wife, you condense that and the scene where he's leaving into one scene later, where the wife can complain about how she lost the husband to the CIA, and it's the same part where he's telling the family he's moving to California. You can move that into a tighter scene that still gets your same beats
Hmm.
for what you want to get. You got the wife saying that he's and it's important because what I liked about it's the Hallmark thing. I talk to my wife about it. Like if you watch a Hallmark movie, they know their audience.
Yep.
They make sure that the male is never someone who was bad in the previous relationship. He's a widower, or if he is divorced, it's because he was like a workaholic.
Right.
And the previous ex-wife is in a scene to acknowledge that he was always a good guy, he just wasn't there. And it's that way you retain the ability for your audience to like him and move into another relationship without baggage. In this
And
case,
she's
they did
basically
that.
saying, like, you've lost me. This is gonna make you lose your
Lose
son.
him. Yep. And
And
so I think and that naturally leads right into like that conversation works really well if it's also in the same part where they're mixing in that he's moving to California. you
I
know,
mean, well, yeah, because it makes it a heavier scene, and you can thread the exposition a lot easier. And to your point, like having JP recruit Dave, I would say instead of making it an exposition dump in the sense that like what Christopher Nolan does with his films, I would make it more like JP gives him clues, and Dave's answers are him solving it. So he's just like, well, what do you know about the Pacific Ocean? It's deep. Yeah, but what about the marine life? What do you?
it's like
And then just
it's
going
like
back and forth.
if
Where
I
he's,
yeah,
yeah,
like if I dropped something in the Pacific
how
Ocean,
would
you
you
think
get
we
it?
could get it? How would you get it?
How do you get
And
it? It's
he's
like
like and he's like, what are you talking about?
well, where in the Pacific Ocean? About
A deep part.
deep part.
Like
Around
maybe a couple 2-3 miles deep.
a few hours northwest of Hawaii.
Yeah,
He's like,
exactly. And I think there's lots of zones in this script where, like you said, in the briefings, there's a couple parts where they're intercutting from the briefing to other stuff real quick,
yeah,
and that was a little unnecessary for me. I mean, I think if you're in the briefing and the guy was opposed to it, just let him be opposed to it in the briefing. You don't need to keep cutting to him talking to another subordinate about what he didn't like in the meeting. Yeah,
yeah.
it's
Because
and
you're repeating the same information, and
exactly.
you're kind of stagnating the script. But I mean, this has a lot of detail in it, and it's clearly a strong adaptation of the book, and it's basically we want to go seek out the original book,
Yeah,
because I want to know
and
what other things were left out.
yeah, from that 133 page script, I could totally see this getting down to like a 115, 120
Yeah.
tight shooting script with barely I don't want to say not impact, but minimally impactful revisions. Like sometimes I know Denis Villeneuve was just talking about killing his darlings when he was editing Dune, right? This isn't even cutting out anything that's really important at all. It's just tightening and getting to the same beats that you wanted. And I see a really tight, well paced, fantastically successful type movie with another just one quick pass with a couple like with some notes to edit really fast. Like this is the kind of thing I would say get green light and then give those couple notes to get a tightened up shooting script and just hopefully rake in money when it opens.
Oh yeah, like there's the whole scene where they meet John Graham. There's a prefix scene to that where they're meeting John Graham's boss, and it's like 3 or 4 pages, and it's completely unnecessary. You don't need that. It's like, yeah, they're just waiting for him to get back on the boat, back from his boat, so he can come into the mission. It's like, no, just come in with him and walking through the office after being on his boat. He enters in and he's like, "Sorry to keep you guys waiting." And they're like, 3 hours? It felt like 3 minutes. That type of joke to show what actually happened, and then just get right into it. Because that other character, he doesn't come back again at all.
Nope. He was just the vehicle to get to getting Graham.
And
Which
he
is
was completely useless because you just you have the location, you've got Candy. That's all you need. Candy can facilitate that. She's the assistant. And it sets things up there. I wouldn't cut the stress induced near blindness for Dave
no,
because I think that's really important.
I actually appreciated that in the fact that it's giving him genuine consequence to his work life habits.
Mm-hmm.
And I also like the fact that it happened with Candy with him, because
Yes.
it gave a good this is another thing where in the previous relationship we could tell that there were barriers that kept them from being able to stay successful as a married couple. This is again, show don't tell. You have Candy with him when it happens, taking him to the hospital and being there for the diagnosis. So she's in the room. It's a nice visual cue that Candy has already moved into being the confidant with him. Like, he didn't kick her out. He didn't tell her wait outside for me. She was with him. And it's just one of those things where it's a trick. It's not a trick, but it's a good way to visually show, even though they haven't kissed or moved into a traditional romantic relationship yet, they have a partnership, a friendship that is genuine, and he clearly thinks enough of her that he doesn't mind her being there for what is a very impactful diagnosis of his health.
Yeah,
So
and I just think I mean, again, it makes everything else around them have more weight. And because if these were just characters that had that arm's length distance, which we saw with all the supporting characters, the ones whose names we forgot, like Duckett and Riggy, we wouldn't mean anything to us. We wouldn't care. It'd just be empty. So yeah, I think that's awesome. We got a double green light. Now to check in, we do have a Patreon exclusive comment from 52 Movies a Year. Thank you for that. Remember, guys, you can get a chance to see what type of script we'll be reviewing every Saturday on Mondays on my Patreon. That's Script Doctor. That's patreon.com/scriptdoctor. Comes with a 7-day free trial, so sign up, get a taste of what's going on over there, and leave a comment, and we will read it out here on the show and discuss it. And 52 Movies a Year's comment was this. He says, "What I loved about this script is that its primary challenge of building a boat capable of lifting the sub is secondary to the problem of not being seen by the Soviets. We don't have to wonder if the story is plausible because it was actually built and it worked. Or did it?" Yeah, I like the fact that it was a compounded problem. It wasn't just, oh, we got to get the sub. It's, we got to get the sub and we got to make sure the Russians don't know we're doing it so they can't stop us.
yeah, and that's what makes it so much more plausible. It's not like it was just, for me, I just genuinely enjoyed it. It was great fun. I really love man versus nature problems, and then in this case, man versus Soviet Empire problem too.
It hits all three. It's man versus nature, man versus machine. Because again, they have to invent new technology, and they've literally built a 300 times the size of a normal claw machine for the purposes of this, and they had to use actual weight and displacement in order to get this down. They didn't have rockets or anything to propel this thing to the bottom of the ocean floor at 3 miles in depth. They had to feed piping to push it down the old-fashioned way through essentially a giant spool.
Yep, and and thread it down there and actually thread it through. It was just like the idea of what you were doing, like, and it was real, and that it did happen, and it was because we've got tons of for as much as the CIA denies it, there are tons of corroborated sources at the time confirming all of these things happening. There's even footage that they had, that I guess I looked a little up while you're talking, that I guess they did recover some bodies and they did burials at sea and recorded it and sent it to the Soviet Union.
Yep.
So so that they would have, some proof of proper handling of remains and things. It was, man.
It's the code of the sea, which is also the same code of space. So in any event that any astronaut is in danger, regardless of political differences, every single country is obligated to try and save that person. And like even during the Apollo missions, when Russia figured out what was going on, they said, "What can we do to help?" And the United States didn't refuse. They just said, "We already have a plan in action. If we need assistance, we will definitely, you know, ask for that right away. But stand by was basically the order." But that's just the nature that they had at that point. And I thought that was kind of like, man, if you're mature enough to be able to do it there, why can't you be mature enough in the other areas to acquiesce or to balance or compromise in other areas? But I did like the fact that they did that. I also like the fact that they couldn't use cable wires to for their video transmissions and for their remote control transmissions. It all had to be essentially radio and specific frequency stuff, and it was taking bandwidth and power to do that. So they ended up keeping stuff in certain automated protocols as they're raising the sub, and that's when they notice something's wrong. And when they boot up the visual cameras that are transmitting from Clementine, that's when they realize they lost a little bit over 2/3 of the sub because they weren't monitoring it as they were bringing it up, and something happened. And it's a human error, but it always leads to the fact that it's like, yeah, it required a lot of resources and a lot of new technology and technology borrowed from other private contractors and departments in order to get this whole thing working. And it was a huge endeavor, and I think it was like a 40-day mission, if I'm not mistaken, from the history books. So that's a long time just to do one thing. But yeah, this was concept alone, this needs to be a movie right off the bat.
Yeah, I will say, of the 9 or so scripts,
Yep.
I agree. I think we got a comment in there from D Outlaw about this. This was my favorite. This is like, of all the scripts we've looked at, there's a couple tight edits like we talked about to maybe get it in really good shooting shape, but I absolutely think this would be the best movie out of all the ones we've read.
So far, I pretty much say, yeah, it's definitely up there. And it's nice that we're able to talk about it like this. That the fact that, I mean, I know a lot of people when I announced the show, they're like, "Oh man, there's going to be a lot of terrible screenplays because Hollywood is devoid of creativity." And I said, "Well, hold your horses there. It might not be the case because, again, I read lots of screenplays all the time, and yes, there's a lot of bad ones out there, but sometimes there are some really good ones." And I'm surprised that in 9 episodes, we've had at least 3 scripts that are like a double green light between the hosts. And
Yeah.
that's a pretty good ratio considering the fact that most movies that come out, and you know this from your experience running theaters, most movies are flops and bad and bombs.
Yep.
and it's just the nature of the game, and you need those tent poles to pay for those failures. This one here, I think, if you keep it at a modest budget and you really lean into the family aspect of it on the marketing side of things, and the camaraderie and the friendship, and it could definitely be up to the Ford versus Ferrari
Yeah.
type of level.
If I was a studio and I talked with and I was confident a producer could make this work at around 70 to 80 million, I feel like that would be, I would no-brainer green light it. Because at that budget level, it's a pretty good risk reward thing. Because if this thing hits, it should be well into profit, and if it doesn't, you're going to be minimizing through foreign rights sales and other things where you're probably not going to have any exposure to loss from it.
Oh yeah, and I
And
would even say 70 million is like double what you need. You could do this easily for 40.
I was more thinking that some of the depending on how practical you got with some of the cranes and the boats and the things, you might get a little bit, drive some money. And also, if you wanted to put a name on it, if depending on the salaries. But yeah, if you were
Mhm.
doing, if you didn't have names, if it was like a relatively unknown or younger affordable actors,
Emerging talent is
or
what you mean. Yeah.
emerging talent, emerging talent, I would say that this is probably more of like a 45 to $50 million movie. And
Hmm.
because there's no overly CGI stuff you'd have to do. Maybe some of the footage, like the
The
effects for
Clementine stuff and the crane would
raising the
be
subs.
the only special effects you need because everything else is in offices, and it's you know
But what's cool is after seeing like Godzilla Minus One and The Creator and some of those other movies that were very tightly budgeted for the amount of CG they were doing,
mhm.
that was at a very high level. This is the kind of thing with someone who knows how to do CG right, you're probably not going to be breaking the bank on it. And
Exactly.
especially with with the Clementine and raising the sub, those are going to be probably wholly CG shots. You're not going to necessarily need to reshoot anything for that. You should be able to give a very directed um in description to this, to the effects people to develop those shots without having to redo a lot.
Oh yeah, I would be shocked if this movie went to production. I'd be shocked if they had to schedule more than 7 days of actual underwater shoots just for the diver stuff.
Yep.
And because again, it really utilizes exactly what needs to be shown and what doesn't. And putting a boat like there's this whole little scene where they're fighting the waves as they're trying to lower the Clementine, and that's where we get back to that 8 degree on the ballast angle thing, and it's like, well, you don't even need to put the boat on the gimbal. You just have the actors act the motions, and you just hit them with a lot of water, usually with either a rain tower or a typhoon tower or whatever new towers they've come up with since the last time I've had to deal with water on a set.
Yep.
And you make it work because it's not as, it doesn't have to be as costly as one would think. And I would say this would be right up like Paramount or Warner Brothers would be right in line to make a movie like this. This is their type of wheelhouse that they would
I
have
w-
put their stamp on.
if I would even say if I was Sony, I would be really into it because Sony doesn't have a direct streaming service. Now that Warner Brothers is selling rights to other services, because this is the kind of movie that you can get decent, I think, ancillary money by, with streaming rights too.
Yeah.
It would be a good, like if I didn't have a streaming service I needed to feed and I could make money through like my Netflix deal if I'm Sony. This is the perfect kind of like this kind of movie after it had its theatrical run once it hits Netflix would be, and is on the queue, would probably be one of those ones where it immediately jumps to number one in the US where everybody's watching it once Netflix like feeds their subscriber base, and you could get some good numbers on it too. I feel like this is a no lose kind of proposition because you can do it at a moderate budget fairly easily. You've got a very high return possibility with almost no loss risk at a moderate budget. It's the kind of movie they should be greenlight instead of spending 200 million on movies that are poorly made and high risk for profit. You can make like 5 of these, and if any one of them hits, you're in the black for your year.
Yep. Pretty
So,
much. It's not 100% a sure thing, but it's got better odds than a lot of other stuff out there, and it hits a lot of the beats that people tend to like. I mean, this, and the other part too, this movie could travel easily. I mean, it could actually do well in Russia too, because it's able to mock a little bit of the paranoia and incompetency at the same time of the extreme level of competency of the Soviet Union at that time. Like you have the one guy who's like, I know exactly what they're doing, and the stupid Bolsheviks are not paying attention
yeah.
to what I'm telling them right now. I think it would travel well. I think it'd be a good one. So I have to, give props, of course, to the writer here, Mr. Dave Collard. You did a good job, man. If you're
Yeah.
listening, did a good job, and I hope
Yeah.
that you're able to take this to the distance and really get a good team behind you to make it a great crowd pleaser of a film. Um,
Yeah,
that's
hold out for theatrical because this would do well. I mean, if
Oh yeah.
I'm sure streaming services will come in. Maybe. I mean, if that's your only choice, more power to you. Do what's right for you and your family. But this is the kind of thing where I just in a theatrical presentation, I think would come off really good.
All right. Well, that's that's all I've got to say. Anything last
Mm.
you want to say, a little Chad, before we sign off here?
No, I'm really pumped to read a good script that I can be super positive about. Like you said, I was, when this started, worried that we were going to just get bad. And it's nice that, to find something that was just such an enjoyable time for me to read. So thank you for that.
I'm happy to provide that out for you. And for anyone listening, if you cannot find the script, just hit me up on Twitter X or on email at the Script Doctor PhD. I will help you get that. You can find these. It just takes a little elbow grease on the Google search. But if you're having difficulties, just reach out to me, and we can get that shared for you. So before we sign off, little Chad, please tell our audience where they can find you.
Oh yeah, I run a show with my co-host Slender Dad on the Ascendant. It's called the Ascendant Art Podcast. That's the name of our channel on YouTube. So we do shows Friday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern. So it's live streamed. We have fun time. We just talk about whatever. It's more of just a conversational podcast, and sometimes we'll just go off on whatever is fun to talk about. So you don't need to worry that you'll hear the same thing the eighth time this week because it's the end of the week. So hopefully, if you guys join us there, you'll enjoy yourself, and that's kind of what. And then I just pop up on other channels on YouTube, hanging out, talking about stuff I like. So thanks to Script for giving me the opportunity to do that here.
Always a pleasure, and we're gonna see more of you and all the other co-hosts as the show continues. Again, guys, we have scripts for the entire year, so every Saturday there is always going to be something to read and something to talk about that's different than what we've read before. Uh, different in the script itself, but maybe some genres will be similar. I mean, we just came off a bunch of athletic scripts that were back to back. I blame the randomizer number I punched in to select the ones that I picked for this year, but yeah, now we're getting into some other areas, other genres. We got the biopic here. Biopics are a big popular script. That's types of script that go around. So we'll probably see a bunch of those coming up. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Always appreciate your support. And never forget, when it comes to great story, it all starts with the script.